Welcome to the Innovators Playbook podcast. I am your host, Seth Narayanan, founder and CEO of Teliant Systems. Each week, I'll be sitting down with entrepreneurs, product leaders, and technologists who are solving real world problems with bold ideas and smart execution. We will dig into what is working, what's not, and the lessons they have learned turning vision into reality. If you're leading digital transformation, scaling a startup, or just curious how innovation really happens behind the scenes, this is your playbook. Let's get started. I'm very excited today to have Brian Hiatt join me on the podcast today. Brian has more than 3 decades of experience in software industry. He has worked in large corporations such as Xerox, HP, and CSC, and also worked with innovative new startups. Brian has played hands-on roles, starting as a software engineer to being CTO and a CIO for several organizations. He's also an entrepreneur, a cloud expert, to name a few hats that he wears. I know Brian as a customer, as a partner, and a friend in the industry, and generally look forward to our conversation today. I'm very excited. So welcome, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Glad to be here. Looking forward to discussing, and we'll all learn something along the way.
Great. Thank you. Jump right into a few questions, some of the favorite topics that you and I talk about all the time. So first question I have for you is, you are deep in the world of technology leadership for a number of years. And how did your journey lead you to your current leadership role as CIO and CTO for multiple organizations? Can you just paint a picture of how you started and how you ended up?
Yes, I can. So it's interesting. I'll try and not make this too long because, as you can see, I've been in this a long time. And I started out on the business side. My degree is in business management with a minor in accounting. So for the first 5 years out of college, I did accounting and I was very good at it. And this was before computers, before a lot of stuff was automated. So the company that I worked for at the time was a wholesale distributor, and they had a lot of accounting needs related to inventory management and regular accounting. And sometimes I don't know if I like to tell the story or not, but they said, "Hey, Brian, you're the new guy. You're the young guy out of college. We want to automate all of our processes around the inventory, accounting, and everything." And so I got charged with going out, finding accounting systems at the time, and this was before PCs too. And then once I did that, I learned how to vet the vendors and do the whole process of procurement and got to implement it. And so I was very much on the leading edge, at least for this company, of taking them from ledger books to a fully automated accounting system and inventory management. It was pretty hairy at times, but it was a great learning experience.
Wow. So how did you then get from there, which is surprising to me that you started out in accounting, but then you ended up in software. So how did you progress your journey? Did you go back to school to learn software engineering, or did you learn it on the job? How did you get into programming and software?
Yep. So to answer that question specifically, I taught myself how to build software and how to program. I did not take any classes. I didn't start programming until some of the more elaborate IDEs or development environments came out that had a lot of help in them and helpers and logical things. But one of the things that I did was I chose a programming language that was fully object oriented. And that was a big deal at the time because I worked for a company that did a lot of work with Smalltalk, which was probably one of the first object oriented languages at the time. And I got a great interest in that. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this makes a lot. It just clicked in my brain. So I self-taught that part of it. As far as my journey, it's a long journey, but it goes back to the wholesale distribution part of it. We made a discovery that if we could build a point of sale system for the retailers of this wholesale distributor, that we could put that in their stores and build a proprietary EDI system that would automatically reorder what they had sold that day from us. And we did a couple of prototypes and proof of concepts, and we found out that our business as a wholesale distributor increased 20% with those retailers by putting in these systems. So the leadership of the company said, "Brian, we built this, we got it. We want you to go out and put in as many as you can, as fast as you can, free." So I spent 3 or 4 years all over the Southeast installing these point of sale systems, inventory systems in these retailers. And I was crawling in basements, running cabling, doing the whole thing. So I have a lot of experience in the foundational part of it too. We installed some of the first networks like Token Ring and ArcNet and all those kind of things way before Ethernet came out and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of naturally progressed into more and more leadership type roles. And what really helped me in my career progression was, I'm going to go back to the very beginning, is the accounting foundation. Almost all of these systems had some basis for accounting, and I knew accounting end to end on a ledger book.
Wow.
So when I was able to get in these places and work with these customers, I knew what they were talking about. And so that kind of evolved into point of sale systems for a broader market, installed hundreds of those across the Southeast, then went to work for an IBM reseller. And our vertical market, when IBM had vertical market resellers, was retail. So I did a lot more of that and naturally just progressed into leadership. And then I got hooked up with a company or a group of entrepreneurs in Nashville that gave me the opportunity to do IT leadership for them.
Okay.
But what really made me successful in this is continuing to wear that business hat during those times. Everything I did was focused on the business and the outcomes, not the technology.
Very interesting. Yeah, that is a journey indeed. And like you said, a lot of times creating software and then installing it and implementing it in front of a customer and then supporting it. So that those are some of the areas not everybody gets these days, especially when you're making SaaS software, you're not right next to a customer implementing software and seeing them learn and go through the pain process. So that kind of gave you a unique edge in not only building software, but also in understanding how customers use it and then adapting the software to meet those needs. That's a pretty amazing experience that not a lot of people get these days. So that's great to hear. So one question I have there, a general question. You mentioned creating that new software that you saw a need for in the market, right? So that is what I would call innovation, right? So innovation is a buzzword that gets used a lot these days. So what is your view in what constitutes truly an innovation, especially in technology? So there's a lot going on now, but certainly would love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, and I think the word innovation is overused to some extent, and it's been around a long time. It's not like a new buzzword in IT or anything else. To me, innovation is, and you're going to hear this as a recurring theme for me, is solving the business problems. Okay. It's not about the technology. It's not about the platforms. It's about the outcomes of solving the business problems. And the second part of that is I have a real knack for being able to design and implement the right thing for the stage that the company is at in their growth or even in reduction in growth. And there's not a lot of people out there that can keep in mind that we're not trying to build an IT empire. We're trying to solve a business problem and do the right thing. And this group of entrepreneurs in Nashville had me working for 1 to 3 of their companies as CIO, CTO, or even COO at any given time. And their specialty was buying companies that may have been around a while. They would build the sales side, and then I would build the operations and IT side. And they told me many times, Brian, we know you're the one that we can trust to not build an empire, to do just what we need at the time. And it all comes back to financials. It's about money and do the right thing to do what we need to do to build the sales side. And I've always kept that in mind through that. So I know the initial question was about innovation, but I still think it's deeply rooted to solving the business problems.
Now, that's a very valid point that the tool should fit the need. There are a lot of times what I call a solution in search of a problem. So there are times when products are out there that are developed. Google Glass is an example, right? So Google,
Yeah.
we can chuckle about it now, but I think they've come back with a 2.0, which I hear is much better. But that was a technology or a solution that really was not solving any problems, probably in fact creating problems. So that brings me to another question, which is you have seen technologies come and go, right? There are, especially now, it seems like languages appear pretty much out of nowhere every day or every week. So what principles do you use in what technologies should we adapt or adopt, and how do we make that selection and stay relevant? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer in the right tool for the right job. Again, it's not being tied to any one technology, and they do come across rapidly and they change a lot. And a matter of fact, with the client that I'm working with now, we're going through that process right now where we're looking at the requirements to solve the business problem. And instead of going to the tools that we already have in place, maybe something like PHP or something like that, we're looking at other platforms that will give us a better outcome faster and a longer term platform to go forward. Say we've got 3 platforms built, which this client does in PHP. Very good platforms, very robust. They do the job. For this new platform or new extensions to the existing platform, we can build it with PHP. It'd be very easy. But through our analysis, we determined that maybe something like Node.js or something like that might be a better tool to use. And we're pretty much getting very close to saying, yeah, that's what we're going to go forward with. So it's looking at what's out there in the market, what will potentially leave less technical debt in the future. And I know that's somewhat subjective because you can't tell what the future is going to hold, but you have to make as informed as possible decisions about those and make a decision and move forward. One thing we don't do is we don't get paralyzed by making those decisions. We do the analysis, compare it to the business needs, how we can solve the problem, what the pros and cons are of the platforms, and we make a decision and move forward.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point because at the end of the day, most of these tools do about the same. Some might be better at one thing versus another, and they also evolve, right? So version 1.0 or 2.0 of that software or that tool might be very different than when it comes to 8.0. Like Angular, for example, which we all familiar with, the JavaScript library. Initially, when they came out, the first several versions were in one language, and then they switched it all the way to TypeScript, which ended up becoming better at the end of it, but that's a painful learning curve. But I think, do you consider the ecosystem in question when you adopt technology? If it's something relatively new without a big ecosystem around it, is that kind of a red flag for you in that maybe there's not going to be enough engineers out there? And does it have legs for it to sustain over the long term? Is that a factor that you think about?
It is a factor, and I deal with it regularly and have dealt with it within the last few months on that particular item. Some of the clients that I have are very eager to adopt the new technology. And so I sometimes act like a sanity check on that kind of stuff and say, hey, are we sure about this? To me, it's a red flag in a lot of ways. I'm not stuck in the mud where I have to use something that's been tried and true for 10 years, but also they do come and go. And particularly with AI that's coming, we'll look at different platforms that may have some type of AI integration or AI assist in them. And we found that some of the AI part is a lot more robust than others. And so we're also now considering that when we look at the maturity level of the platform.
Yeah, very interesting. You touched on AI. I'll circle back with you. That's a longer discussion topic. But there's one other topic I wanted your viewpoint on. You're also a business owner and you have managed other businesses. Everybody talks about the importance of execution versus the vision, right? So you can have a great strategy, great vision in place, but execution matters, right? So what are some of the things that you have faced? If you have some examples, that would be great on where you found how you balance the vision versus execution.
Yeah, I love this question. And so I've been thinking about this for a little bit. So I have lots of examples of trying to balance execution with vision. So I'll give you an example. I was on a project for a large global IT services company, and it was a data center migration. It was a migration into cloud of about 1,200 server images. We were migrating their messaging and collaboration into Office 365 from on-premise Exchange for about 40,000 employees.
Wow.
Yeah, it was big. We were also outsourcing or migrating all of their IT team to an outsource model. And so we had a lot of moving pieces involved in that. And the project, it was like a 2-year project. So you and I both know things change in 2 years.
Yeah.
One of the key takeaways that I got from that project was one thing is that the end state didn't change. The client didn't change it. The company didn't change it. We kept that same target throughout the project because if you start trying to introduce new processes, new platforms, new ways of doing things in the middle of a project, it can go red very fast. But what I also did during that project, and I was leading that project, by the way, is every 3 to 4 months, we would do something that I would call a reset. And I made that word up. I didn't make the word up, but that's what I call it. I can't think of a better word for it. So the leadership on the project, along with some of the leadership from the outsourcing company, the IT company, would get together and look at what we've done in the last 3 or 4 months and make sure that we were, one, again, achieving the business goals and also any potential innovation that we should consider either for post project or in project. And we would debrief on that. And if there's any findings out of that, we would talk to the client about possibly integrating those into the project. We didn't come up with a whole lot because we were focused on getting that project done in green status and done as fast as possible. It's a balancing act between innovation and execution. What I've seen in a lot of these projects is you get so focused on execution that you lose sight of potential innovation. And so that's why we do that reset every month. And the reset was to say, hey, are we still meeting with our approach and continued approach that we're proposing, still going to meet the business goals?
Yeah. Yeah. That is the root of why the whole agile project management theory has come to take root. So I think when I first read the Agile Manifesto, it was so obvious that when you start a project in the old days, waterfall project, you said 2 years, which is a really long time. Even a 6-month project, a lot of times things change. Once the project is conceptualized, planned, you start to execute the project, the end goals can change. The people that made the original decision to go with that project might not be there in the company anymore, or maybe their priorities have changed, the markets have changed. So having agile execution is so important, like you point out. I'm assuming you are a believer in agile. So maybe talk to me. You've been in business so long that agile is a word. I don't know how old it is. It might be 15, 20 years old, but
Yeah.
we come from the old Microsoft project days where you put together a huge project which had sub projects, and that took on hundreds of resources and spanned months, if not years. I don't know if those projects still are managed like that. Maybe there are some areas, like maybe in construction, where that still makes sense, but agile has pretty much taken over everything that we do in software. So talk to me a little bit about what is your take on agile project management today.
I think it lends itself very well to particularly software development projects or product development projects. It allows you to adapt and morph, and I'm on a couple of them right now where we're using the methodology, and we've been able to adapt as we go and make changes to small sprints, and you get them done and you decide if anything new needs to be in the next sprint or changed or something like that. So for those, I think it works really well. For these large scale monolithic projects, like I was talking about a couple minutes ago, they're more like a construction, to use your analogy. It's kind of, okay, these are primarily infrastructure migration and IT outsourcing projects. There's very little transformation in them. It's when these companies would sign on with these large IT outsourcing companies that I worked for, it would be to outsource their IT to this company. And so we did it in two phases. One was to transition it into our control as is. Sometimes we migrated it into cloud at the same time, but we didn't transform anything. It was a second phase. And that allowed the IT outsourcing company to propose a second phase and generate another contract, more revenue, whatever, those kind of things for the transformation. And it also made the transition part of it much more safer and much easier to do. So I did not run many of the transformation projects that engaged after the transition. But for those, I think Agile would be a lot better because you're taking maybe legacy applications and including mainframe applications and even some mid-range type applications, migrating those into client server. And for those, you have to have an Agile methodology because as you're working through those things, you can either spend 2 years up front dissecting the entire current state of the application and functionality, or you can do it in an approach where you divide it into pieces and analyze as you go along, which lends itself a lot better to those type of things.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of, if you want to scale Mount Everest, they have these camps along the way. So you land in base camp and then you regroup and look at the conditions and figure out what your strategy is going to be for the next phase. So I guess agile is something like that. You mentioned cloud, and I know that you are a expert in cloud and an early adopter of cloud, and you're certified. You use in your roles different cloud platforms. Where do you see the whole cloud technology evolve, both from a technology perspective and business model? So things like the cost aspect of it. I think once you become captive to a cloud provider, it seems like, I don't know, the rates are going up, or are we consuming more resources, but the bill keeps going up, right? So we need to kind of balance cost and the definite advantage you have in a cloud solution or a cloud platform. But what are some of the factors that you're wrestling with right now with cloud?
Well, cost is always one of them. Every client that I have that I've worked with their cloud is struggling with cost. It just, like you said, keeps growing and growing. What I see happening to cloud, and I can't foresee the future, to me, cloud is kind of like two different things. It's infrastructure, where you can provision infrastructure, compute and memory and storage and all those kind of things. Pretty kind of utilitarian. And I don't see that changing very much. There's not much more you can do in that space. And that will always be, at least, well, not always, but for the near future, the bread and butter of cloud is we want to get it out of our data centers. We want to go from a CapEx to an OpEx model. That's cost management aside. It makes a lot of sense. To me, it's like a utility. You flip the light switch and the light comes on. That's the way cloud is. But where I see cloud heading is more into services, and services like, particularly with AI, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, integrated in that will assist with solving business problems. And so those services will be available, and they could come in a number of different forms. You could maybe even have a service that allows something like you can describe a business problem that you want to solve. And the cloud service could actually ideate, design, potentially even build, test, and deploy a prototype of that, or even a real thing without a lot of human interaction. That's maybe way out there in the future, but that's where I see the future of cloud is not on the utility side of it, but on the services side, and particularly leveraging AI as it becomes more mature.
Yeah, you're right. I think that all the cloud providers are offering their extended services, right? So like Azure, you have that Azure SQL. So SQL is becoming as a service instead of running SQL Server. You can use the Azure SQL services. Same thing with the Lambda functions in AWS and image processing tools. There are so many such functional aspects that they provide to you in addition to core hardware stack that it does become easy to adapt and to get your product and get your platform very advanced quickly by consuming these services. But as you say, is it cost effective enough? And that is something that I think is going to be an open question.
Yeah, I think that's the big question. And I'm thinking even more boldly beyond platform as a service where they manage the infrastructure and it's SQL Server or whatever. And I'm thinking about, and this is really bold, but it's again a day when you can state a problem, either compose it or speak it, and the system can come back with a foundational prototype for that, including if it includes database, if it includes service bus, if it includes everything that they do, it takes care of all that. Now, I don't think that will cut out engineers and architects. I think it will change their job role slightly, where you'll see that the humans will be able to spend more time taking what, if it is AI, outputs and refining it and putting the final finishing touches on it.
Yeah.
And when we talk about AI a little bit, I'll say a couple more things related to that.
Yeah, maybe let's dive into AI. But before we do, you mentioned a good point, which is there are these low code, no code platforms, right? So that kind of give you the ease of building applications, and they also let you host it on their platform. I think, as you're saying, I don't see why a cloud provider can kind of integrate that into their core services, and we can build large applications through some prompts, and the apps get built, they run on the cloud. And the only issue I've always seen is that when it comes to scaling it, or when it comes to those nuances that you want to differentiate yourself from other providers, is how flexible are we working with brick and mortar, or are we working with prefab construction here, where there are things that you cannot do in a low code, no code environment that may be needed to differentiate yourself or give those advanced features that you're planning to offer to your customers. So that, I think, is a concern. Can I agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I've spent a lot of time researching prototyping with different low code, no code platforms. And at least as of last year was the last time I did it, there are a lot of barriers. And they revolve around things like you're talking about, scalability and nuances, but also even as simple as things like multi-tenant kind of stuff. They just sometimes don't do a very good job of multi-tenant. And not to mention that their business, most of these companies' business models are is they lock you in to their platform. And that's a huge problem from a couple of standpoints. For me, from a business perspective, it's a problem because of intellectual property. And we all know that the value of a company can be very highly influenced by whether they own their intellectual property or whether it's leveraged by someone else or something like that. And I always advise executives that I deal with on this topic that if your strategy is to build a company and exit it at some point, which almost everybody is because we don't live forever, you're better off building it and owning your intellectual property end to end and having it protected. It also might be very difficult to patent something that was built on some of these other platforms.
Yeah.
And Microsoft's trying to make their way into that space with the Power Apps or whatever they are. And I've investigated them and prototyped them extensively and ran into roadblocks every time on them. So they're not there yet. I'm thinking something bigger, better, that may use more native extensible languages or platforms that already exist that make it easier for you to get to that initial what do we call MVP or prototype.
Yeah, I think we are walking into this AI conversation.
Yeah.
Let me pose a question around that. We can talk about a lot of different things. So we have the AI tools, the generative AI tools, and in functional areas like legal or even HR, there are things that you can do using AI. I've heard of tools where an interview is conducted by an AI bot, and then it gives a report at the end of it on the suitability of that candidate and so on. I think a lot of HR firms are starting to adopt that. And then you have coding tools in AI, right? So these are increasingly being adopted. There are several tools now like Codex or Copilot and Cursor that write the code to a large extent. They build it and they can create test scripts with it. And so the entire process of code building is getting ridiculously simplified. So So let's talk about that a little bit. And where do you see that evolving, and how do you see that impacting the whole software industry as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Seth. I've thought about this one a lot and over the last 6 months or so. And I've actually done a little bit of evaluation of some of these tools that report to be able to low code, or not low code, no code, but use AI to help you build platforms and things like that. In building a couple of, say, prototypes using those tools, I see them about 65% there. Now, I'm assuming that number will get better. Okay. But maybe I don't think I'll ever get to 100%. Maybe it will someday beyond my time. But so that leaves a chunk, a portion, whether it's 10% or 15%, that's still going to have to be intervened and interacted with through a human being that understands the business side of it. I don't AI can, I think, can understand some of the business side, but I don't think you can feed it enough information about the business problems and the business needs yet for it to be able to come up with something that is beyond, say, 70 or 85% complete.
Yeah, that's a good question to ponder, because is it ever, because when as an innovator, you've created platforms. I've had the opportunity to create platforms. There are a lot of nuances there that can it be simplified into providing prompts, or is AI going to think for you and come up with those prompts itself, maybe on what you make the platform do? So there is just maybe, is there a part of that last mile, part of that bridge that cannot be crossed by AI? Or is it going to be counterproductive at that point, where spending more time with AI is not really going to get you to the end result, but you're going to get into some kind of a perpetual maze there that you can't get out of? So those are some of the questions that I wonder about. Let me ask you this. How do you, looking at it from, you were a software engineer at one point, and I was a software engineer, and there are a lot of people still coming out of colleges with computer science degrees and wanting to become software engineers. How do you see that changing? Are we talking about a 50% drop off in the demand in the next 10 years, or are we talking about how bloody is it going to be?
I think it's going to be relatively bloody. I think it's more than 50%.
Okay,
I see a shift into more senior level engineers that can take what the AI, or whatever you want to call it, systems output, and take it to that last mile, to use your phrase. So less junior, fresh out of college, cutting their teeth engineers, and more senior engineers, like the really good ones. And that, to me, that's an opportunity. I When I say it's above 50%, maybe that's a little bit pessimistic, because I think the demand for the really highly skilled ones will be increased and in numbers. And so some of those, what we call junior ones or entry level, those jobs may go away, will replaced partially by some of the jobs for the more senior engineers. Now, what that tells me is that, and this goes a little bit off from technology, is that the entities that are providing these types of educational services to software engineers, i.e., trade schools, colleges, universities, they need to look at their game, or how so to speak, and if need to step that up so that when people do come out, they're more they're more in that senior space from a knowledge standpoint, not from a actual experience standpoint, but from a knowledge standpoint, so that they can transition into more of a senior role quicker and knock these things out. But I do still see a day that it may not even be so much prompt based, Seth. I'll sit down and talk to my computer and say, I need to build a platform that will do this, or I'll write a document and upload it or whatever. And it may come back, the AI may come back with some questions and clarifications, kind of like we do during brainstorming requirements gathering. And it will actually take it from idea through to at least an MVP. Now, that may be years away, but I see that happening. I see it. It's coming. I'm
Yeah,
convinced.
I agree that technically I don't see any barriers to it. So, like we think about it today, if you want to create let's say, a SaaS platform for, for lack of a better thing, say a recruitment platform, right? That you want to have an interviewing module, a candidate ATS, applicant tracking system, and you just tell AI to build me a recruiting platform that does these five things. And certainly it has the smarts. Maybe you can come up with an outline proposal, and then you bless it in a certain way, and then it goes about building it. It builds the cloud backend, it builds the database, it builds the front end, it builds the apps. All that, I don't see why the app or the AI agent cannot do it all on its own. So essentially, what you end up doing then is you're outsourcing thinking, right,
Yeah.
to this AI entity, which As exciting as that is, it also sounds dangerous on what's the role of a human going to be at that point. And also, I'm always thinking that is it humans that are gonna extend the periphery of what human potential is, or is it possible for a automated agent like an AI to come up with those things? Right? Where do we want to do next, or what is the frontier we're going to cross? Is that too scary a question?
I don't think it's too scary. There's a lot of questions around the ethical and compliance and other aspects of AI that'll have to be sorted out. And it's going to be interesting to see. Some of those will end up probably being in the legal system, some will be in the moral system that we have. But from a practical standpoint, I still think that the skill sets that software engineers need, my analogy would be you're taking over a platform that someone else built. So you got to spend some time figuring out what it does by looking at the code and all those kind of things. They'll need enhanced skills in that to be able to understand what was created for them by a machine, we'll call it, because someone's going to have to own the extensibility of it. And that's a whole nother conversation. It's like for applications that maybe you do build using mostly AI, how do you extend those with new features and new enhancements? Does AI do 80% of it? Where does the human come in? So there's a lot along that chain. Applications don't just come out and never change. It's very rare.
In fact, it's funny you mentioned that because just this morning I was reading that I think it was Codex or it might be another tool that has this extensibility built into it, in that it can read pre-existing code and you can ask it to make changes. So they're thinking about it, and I think they're going to attempt to do that. And it would be interesting to see if one AI tool's code base is being able to be read by another one's and vice versa, right? So it's going to be super interesting. This is a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, we could carry this one on for a while.
Let me get to one last question again about innovation, right? What I want to ask you is, what is your advice sitting at your vantage point after all these years of experience, what you've seen and what you're seeing coming up in the horizon? How do you manage driving innovation? I know it's a kind of a super arching question, but I would like your kind of high-level thoughts on how do we manage innovation, especially in technology out there?
Yeah, and I'm going to fall back to the recurring theme I think you've heard throughout this is that technology doesn't drive innovation. Business drives innovation. Keep your foot in the business side of it.
Yeah.
Keep yourself close to the leadership that are making the decisions. And also, don't be afraid to challenge those decisions with leadership. I found that while there are some autocratic type of leadership styles out there, most of the leaders that I've worked with are very open to validating and challenging what they're coming through. But to me, this has nothing to do with technology. This innovation has nothing to do with technology platforms, skill sets, and those kind of things. It's what does the business need to stay competitive, be more competitive, hurt their competitors, or take market share away from their competitors, build their market share, all those kind of things. Stay with that, and the innovation will fall into place.
Well said. So thank you, Brian, for your time. It was great chatting with you on these topics and really look forward to our continuing relationship. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you so much, Seth. It's been a lot of fun, and of course, it gets my mind going, thinking even more about things that are going on. So again, thank you.